Been late to one of these things. Just completely lost track of time. I'm in. I was down in Miami for the Bitcoin conference, and I was at the hotel today, the Hilton for Rebel that we're going to use for Rebel Capital's live next weekend, dropping off T-shirts and everything. I drove up to West Palm today on my way up to Orlando, and I stopped off to grab dinner and just totally lost track of time. So I apologize, but let's dive into it here. Let's get into your questions. Let's see what we got for this evening. Okay, we've got, hi George, Mr. President is planning on banning, wait a minute, Mr. President is planning to ban on investments in Chinese companies and dollar is losing value. China's rising economy. How would you advise an investment? Well, I mean, that's a really difficult question for me to answer, Aaron, because I don't invest that way. I don't try to figure out what's going up or down in price. I don't try to figure out if the dollar is going up or down. I do on my videos, my YouTube videos, but really that's more kind of a thought experiment, and I'm doing that to help everyone, including myself, understand the system better. But that's not how I manage my portfolio. I don't go around thinking to myself, well, what's going to, excuse me, I don't go around thinking to myself, well, what's the dollar going to do? Is it going to go up or down? Oh, if it's going to go down because China is doing this and this and this, and oh my gosh, the dollar is going to crash. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and short the dollar, or I'm going to buy gold, or I'm going to buy Bitcoin because I know it because of what's happening with China right now. I'm confident the dollar is going to collapse. This is it. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. I don't invest that way. I don't think that's a very good way to invest. If you want to do it, more power to you, but I would not suggest doing that because you're trying to predict the unknowable. And it's true that there can be probabilities and there are no certainties, and you're trying to predict the probabilities of XYZ. But the only thing that's knowable in the investing game is something cheap or is it expensive? And so you'd have to ask yourself, is the dollar cheap or is it expensive? And that doesn't have anything to do with what China is doing. It doesn't have anything to do with there being some sort of catalyst to have the dollar crash in value. I mean, let's look at real estate in 2012. Most of you guys on the live stream know that that's when I retired, and I went in almost all in to real estate in 2012. Did I do that because I thought, oh my gosh, everyone is selling the real estate, everyone hates it, it's an unloved asset class, and I know the Fed is going to print money over the next, or increase their balance sheet from 800 billion. Well, it's more than that in 2012, but prior to the GFC, they're going to increase their balance sheet up to 4.5 trillion, and then we're going to have the cerveza sickness, and there's going to be no supply of housing, and lumber prices are going to quadruple, and there's going to be this mad rush to buy houses in suburbs. Therefore, my houses in Kansas City happen to be in the suburbs. Therefore, they're going to triple in price. And no. I didn't have that conversation with myself. The only conversation I had with myself is I looked at a long-term chart of housing prices adjusted for inflation, And then I just looked at the cash flow that the houses were throwing off relative to my cost basis. And I said, is this cheap right now? And the answer was very simple. Yes. Therefore, I bought a lot of houses. You see the difference? And I think if you try to just construct a portfolio based on assets that you think are going up or down in price due to XYZ catalyst, I just don't think you've got a mathematical edge there. Because look at who you're competing with, Aaron. You're competing with Kyle Bass. You're competing with Jim Chanos. You're competing with Stan Druckenmiller. You're competing with Jim Rogers. I mean, let's be honest. Do you think that you've got an edge over Kyle Bass? No, we don't. I don't. You don't. We're not billionaire hedge fund managers. So we don't have the resources to allocate to figuring out what's going to happen to the dollar if China or if the president decides to ban Chinese investments. There's too many variables. It's like the weather. See, there's so many variables that the weather is almost impossible for even the top meteorologist to predict more than 10 days out. And what's going to happen with the dollar, especially in the short term, is the exact same. So the bottom line there is I would just try to stick with asking a question. The first question you ask is it cheap or is it expensive? And then once you ask that question, then move on to what do I think the price of this is going to do, or what do I think the price direction is going to be over the long run. But I don't even know if I'd ask that question because I don't think it's relevant unless you're just trying to figure stuff out because it's a fun thought experiment and you want to try to figure out kind of what's happening in the world and what direction the financial winds are blowing, then go for it. But the reason I'm saying this so adamantly is you specifically say, how would you advise on investing? And so that's why I suggest investing with a little different mindset or different priorities. Question, in your own words, can you explain what carbon credits are and how to capitalize on them? Yeah, so definitely go back and watch my interview with Marin Katusa. But and I haven't studied them extensively, but from what I gather, if there's a specific, it's like a ratings agency that's approved by the government or the central planners that gives companies carbon credits due to how well they're behaving or how good they're behaving. And they say, oh, you've been a good little boy, corporation XYZ. You put in solar panels or something like that. We're going to give you 10 carbon credits. And then there's a market for those carbon credits because the company can sell them on the open market to a company that might not have installed solar panels. And they need to get their carbon footprint down. And even though they're literally not getting their carbon footprint down, as long as they can tell the government they've got credits to offset the amount of carbon they're producing, they're still producing the same amount of carbon, but they have those credits to offset the amount of carbon they're producing. And those credits might have been given to another company to begin with and then sold, right? Very similar to how Trump was well known for selling or buying air rights in New York to build higher than he otherwise would have allowed he was allowed to build higher than he otherwise would have been allowed to build, because he simply, although this building structure, and something to this effect, although this building was only allowed 20 stories because of the way it was zoned, he purchased the air rights from someone else that allowed him to build up to 40. That's not the exact way it happened, but it was something to that effect. And another way to think about it is, I knew a buddy of mine who did a project with his father, and they're very well known. They did this real estate project in Kansas City where they purchased a high school from the city that was not being used, and it was right in the hood, in the ghetto. But it hadn't been used in maybe 15 years or so, and so it was just sitting there. I mean, it's a whole high school, like a track and football field, like parking lot and everything. And so it was just an eyesore. It wasn't generating any revenue. So they, when they purchased this this high school, and I think they bought it for like 600 grand or something like that. But what they negotiated is a bunch of tax credits. So the city said, okay, we'll sell this to you for 600 grand, but we'll give you like $1 million worth of tax credits in addition to the property that you can use against future taxable income. And what they did is they actually sold those tax credits on the open market to help fund the rehab, for lack of a better word, of the high school, because they turned it into a co-working space. And their budget, I don't know what their budget was. Their budget was a lot more than $1 million. But I think they sold those tax credits. I don't know how they might have sold them for more than $1 million. But anyway, they took the revenue from the tax credits. They started the remodeling process, and then they showed the bank the progress. Then they showed them pro forma financials and projections, and then they borrowed another, let's say, 10 million from the bank to complete the job. And then once they got very close to completion, and I'm assuming the project's been completed, I haven't been back there in a long time, but their game plan was to complete the project, to get every the majority of the space occupied in this co-working space, and then go back to the bank and say, okay, bank, now based on the cash flow, this project is worth $50 million. Let's go ahead and take out 80% of our equity, 80% LTV. So what's 80% of 50 million? Call it 35? Sometimes that, or 40, excuse me. So you take out 40 million, and what was your cost basis? 600,000. It's a damn good return. And the reason, and they had zero money out of pocket for the remodel. But that first initial phase of the remodel, which allowed them to go back to the bank and borrow the rest of the money they needed, was funded by the sale of those tax credits that they got from the city, that they sold to a completely different entity or corporation, and that corporation used those tax credits, although they didn't, the city didn't give them to them, they just bought them, and they had the rights to them. So similar concept, I think, with the carbon credits, from what I understand, but I need to do more homework on it. Yeah, so this is probably more my style, Blake. Blake asks, could you find yourself buying Chinese equities like TME, Baidu, or I believe Alibaba, as by all relative terms they are cheap right now, and majority of their negative sentiment seems to be winning? Yeah, so that's more my style. You got it. I'm not saying that I would buy any of those because I haven't really looked into them. I know Lynn Alden has talked about a couple of them in Rebel Capitalist Pro. I don't recall which ones, but you know, I have not looked into them. But this is, so what you're doing right there, Blake, is you're trying to buy $1 for 50 cents. That's what I like. So you're trying to look at an existing business that has positive cash flow, and you're saying, okay, what is this cash flow, and how can I buy that stream of cash flow at a discounted rate? And so the company doesn't have to do the price of the shares really don't have to do anything. They just need to keep making that revenue, and assuming the PE goes back to a historical average, which is, this is the homework you got to do, then you know you're going to have capital appreciation. You know, if they pay dividends, that would be even better, because you're buying a stream of income, quite literally. Yeah, so it's like a rental property, right? When I bought those rental properties in 2012, nothing had to happen in order for that investment to succeed. Nothing needed to happen to the price. You see, what we were talking about earlier, in order for an investment to succeed, the dollar would have to crash. Okay, well, maybe the dollar crashes, maybe it doesn't for the next 6 months. I don't know. You know, will it crash over the next 10 years? Probably. You know, probably be a lot lower. But who knows what's going to happen in the next 6 months, or the next year, or the next 2 years even, right? But my point is, something has to happen in order for the investment to work out. Now compare that to buying a rental property. Nothing has to happen to the price. Zero. The only thing that has to happen is you got to collect the rent that is already being produced by the asset. So the asset just has to keep doing what it's doing. If the price goes up, great. If the price goes down, I don't care, because I'm not selling. Doesn't matter to me. So this, my point is, this is more along the lines of what I would like, this would spark my interest. Now, again, to be clear, I have not done the homework on any of these. So I don't know if they're quote unquote cheap. I don't know what their revenues are. But another thing I like too, Blake, is I like buying panic. And so if you're buying $1 for 50 cents due to some sort of panic in the market, then that's where I start to get interested. Question: Australian housing government gives tax breaks to negative cash flow investments, first home grants, which causes rising prices. Will this create permanent unaffordability? No. No, because the government isn't as powerful as the market at the end of the day, Timothy. Now, I realize you guys haven't had a correction there in, what, 25, 30 years? Something like that. But at the end of the day, there's no free lunch. And it's you got to pay the fiddler. And they're just kicking the can down the road. So, yes, you're going to get a crash. I don't know when, nor do I know if housing prices will crash in nominal terms or in real terms. You know, Australian look, did the price of housing ever go down in Venezuela, denominated in bolivars? I don't think so. I think it went straight up. In fact, I would probably guess the Venezuelan housing market is probably the best performing housing market of the last 10 years by far, because it's going up in nominal terms. But the amount of stuff that you can buy with that house, if you were to sell it, has been steadily decreasing. So in real terms, it has lost value. It's lost purchasing power. But the price has gone through the roof. See? So it's a much more nuanced question than people usually ask. Usually they're just, is the housing market going to crash? Well, that's too broad of a question. You've got to dig into the details and try to figure out, how is it going to crash? How is it going to come back to planet Earth? How is it going to come back to the level of income? Because at the end of the day, a mortgage is paid by income. And unless the government starts paying everyone's mortgage payment, which maybe they will, I don't know. Maybe that's how in 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Because you won't own your house. The government will own it. Therefore, you never have to worry about the price going down. All you have to do is rent it. I don't know. Maybe that's the direction we're going here. But unless the government is making your mortgage payment for you, then the income or the mortgage needs to be paid by the income. It's not, we forget about that. So the mortgage payments can only go so high. They can only go so high. And the only thing that you can adjust is either the real incomes, and if they're not going up, the only thing that you can adjust is the interest rate. If you've already got interest rates at 1%, or, sure, I guess you could go negative. Maybe that's where we're headed. But, I mean, how far negative can you go? And it's going to be tough until a time in which you ban cash and get a central bank digital currency, which I think is probably in the cards. But they haven't rolled it out yet. So I think that's what we've really got to focus on is prices crashing in nominal terms or real terms. Selling a house with 100K equity, should I take equity and buy rental houses in Jacksonville or put it towards a new house? I can't answer that question, Sean. It really depends on your situation. So let me give you an example. If you are making, let's say you've got a job or you've got a business where you're making $1 million a year. That's a completely different scenario than if you've got a job and you're making $50,000 a year. That's night and day difference. And that would definitely go into your decision-making process when you're talking about selling a house and then what to do with the 100 grand in equity, because you've got a lot more wiggle room in your ability to take risk. Another thing is, how old are you? There's a lot of these variables that need to be answered and thoroughly considered before you decide what you can do specifically with that $100,000, because you've got to decide how much exposure to risk, and then why are you buying it, right? What would be the objective of buying a rental house in Jacksonville? What would be the objective of taking out a HELOC and doing a BRRRR strategy? A lot of times that's a great way to go, but it depends what you're trying to do. And then another thing that you've got to realize is, what does the rest of your portfolio look like? And one thing I'd really encourage you guys to do, if you haven't already, is listen to the interview I did with Chris Cole. It was a long interview. I mean, we kept going and going and going. And actually, Chris and I talked quite extensively after we stopped recording, because I didn't realize how much we had in common. But my point is, one thing that we really focused on is the portfolio construction and how crucial it is to prioritize the portfolio construction. What I mean by that is, it's not just about, okay, should I take the $100,000 and buy a rental property in Jacksonville? It depends on what the rest of your portfolio is. You're talking about a HELOC, you're talking about a BRRRR strategy, which I would assume your end goal there would be to have some sort of 30-year fixed rate debt mortgage on your balance sheet, or used to secure or pull out equity in this rental property. So 30-year fixed rate mortgage is a short position on the dollar. So let's just say that you do that with $100,000. Okay, well, now you not only have that property as an asset on your balance sheet, but you also have to consider the fact that you've got a $100,000 short dollar position. So how many people are thinking through that in terms of how that interacts with the rest of their portfolio? I would argue very few people. And Chris had a fantastic analogy when he told the story of Dennis Rodman and the Chicago Bulls. And that Dennis Rodman, statistically, when you look at his scoring, was terrible. But he could flat out get a rebound better than anyone. And because of his ability to rebound, if he would get those 20 or 25 rebounds a game, that means there's 20 or 25 extra scoring opportunities for Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen. You see? And so by bringing on a player like Dennis Rodman, that if he was an asset, no one would ever buy, because the probability of him going up in price would maybe be very low. But the fact that you have that Dennis Rodman on your team, or the fact that you have that XYZ asset on your portfolio, it makes the whole thing much stronger. And it increases your mathematical edge. And if you do that well, now you've got a portfolio that has a greater chance of succeeding over the long run. You see? So I understand that I didn't really answer your question specifically, because I think your question leads us to a topic which very few people address, and I think very few people actually think about, but is vitally important. And so hopefully you can forgive me for going off on a tangent there and not answering your question directly, because I can't answer your question, Sean, because I just don't know you well enough. I don't know your story and everything that's going on. Probably the same thing here. Question: cash out 401k, pay early withdrawal fee, going to real estate, physical gold, concerned about. Yeah, same thing, Joel. It all depends, man. I mean, I can tell you what I would do in my situation is, I would not want my money in a 401k unless it was I think they have self-directed 401ks, I think. And you guys, obviously, I don't know anything about 401ks. I know nothing about IRAs. I've never had one in my life. I haven't been an employee in well over 20 years. So, and it was never applicable to any gig I had. So, and I had no desire to have a 401k or an IRA. So, but unless it's self-directed, then that might make sense. But I always like having total control. And most of the people that comment on my videos and ask me these questions, they do so because they're limited in choice by what they are allowed to invest in. So you've got this fund, you've got that fund, and if you have to invest in one of those, or else you've got to withdraw the money and take the tax hit. And if I'm limited like that, personally, I'd rather take the tax hit. Another thing too that you've got to realize is looking at probabilities. The probabilities are extremely high that taxes are going to be much higher in the future than they are right now. So it could be prudent, if you're going to take the money out, to take the money out now, because you're most likely going to pay a much lower tax rate than you would if you are wanting to pull the money out in the future. And let's say the market is crashing, or the funds that are available to you are crashing in value, and you want to take out that money. You've taken a 50% haircut. How bad is it where you've taken a big haircut, but yet you also have to pay an 80% tax rate? And I'm not saying it's going to be 80%, but you get my point. So again, I don't know your personal situation, so I cannot give you any type of investment advice. I can just say, if it were me and I was restricted, I would take the cash out. I'd pay the tax, take the hit, and I don't know if I'd go into real estate. I'd definitely just do my 10-80-10 portfolio. So I'd do 10% gold. I'd do 80% in assets that pay me to own them, and that's how I defined investments. And then I do 10% of the portfolio in speculative assets. They might not pay you to own them, but I think that there's good asymmetry, and they may be cheap. I already have a modified loan from 2008. I have good credit now. I want to fix up a tiny cottage, rent it out for passive income. Should I take out a HELOC as a first mortgage to pay in 5 to 7 years? I'm getting a lot of these questions tonight. It just so depends. I hate to kind of cop out and kind of punt on the question, but it's just, I guess I can tell you what I would do. Let me read the question. I have good credit now. I want to fix up a tiny cottage right now for pass. Should I take out a HELOC as a first mortgage? I'm not sure if you're asking me to take out a HELOC on the tiny cottage. Write it out. Let's see. I've modified loan. I have good credit now and want to fix up a tiny cottage to rent out for passive. Okay, so I'm assuming you're talking about taking out a HELOC on your house, maybe to fix up a completely separate property, a tiny cottage. I'm assuming you're not taking the HELOC out on the tiny cottage. I don't know why you wouldn't term it out. So you're talking about, I'm guessing you've gone to your bank and they've said, yeah, you can take out a HELOC, but you've, home equity line of credit, but you've got to pay it back within at maximum 5 to 7 years, and you've got to start making monthly payments. There's probably a very low interest rate because it's a line of credit, but it is adjustable, I would assume, as a first mortgage to pay. Yeah, so I would just, if you took out a HELOC, and if you had that in an asset that was positive cash flow and you plan on keeping it, you don't plan on selling it, I would just go and refinance and take that HELOC and turn it into a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. See, so if you've got let's say you've got a small community bank that doesn't do 30-year fixed rate mortgages, but they give you this HELOC, just take it to Wells Fargo or whatever and refinance it, and they'll pay off the HELOC, and then they'll pay it off with the money that you get from a 30-year fixed rate loan. That's what we call it, just term it out, is what I call it. I don't know if that's the proper term. So then you've got that secured with 30-year fixed rate debt, which I would consider an asset, especially that cottage was throwing off good passive income, compared to a HELOC, which I would not consider an asset at all, especially if it's like a normal HELOC that I've used in the past that's an adjustable rate. That's not good debt, in my opinion. That's bad debt. What happens to jobs that create debt in the U.S.? What happens to jobs that create debt? I'm not sure I'm totally following your question, Brady. What happens to jobs that create debt? I don't know, like government jobs that we pay for by increasing the national debt due to deficit spending. I'm not sure, maybe infrastructure jobs that are created as a result of deficit spending and increasing the debt. I think that's maybe where you're going with it. But you've got, let's say you're talking about infrastructure. I'm not a huge fan of infrastructure spending in the United States because I think it's kind of fake news. And what I mean by that is economists seem to think that infrastructure spending is just this silver bullet. It's just this magic that solves all problems and just creates an economic windfall. Not really. It depends, right? Like I use the example of Colombia. If you were, right now, there's no highway between Medellin and Bogota because the mountains, it's very, very difficult to build a road like that. And FARC would just go ahead and blow it up every single time you tried to build one. So that was a problem. But if you were able to, if the government was able to deficit spend to actually build a highway between Medellin and Colombia and reduce the travel time driving from the 12 hours that it takes now down to 3 hours, which it would probably go down to if you had a proper highway in there like I-10 or I-5 in the United States. That is a fantastic, that's the infrastructure spending that all of the politicians in the United States pretend we would have, meaning there's a huge multiplier effect on that as far as economic growth. So for every dollar you spent, it would create $4 or $5 of economic growth. But let's just think that through. Tell me a place in the United States, just tell me 2 cities where there would be a massive amount of economic growth if there was just a highway between them. It's a trick question, right? Because there is no city like that. There are no 2 cities like that in the United States. There's a damn highway going everywhere. There's highways to little hillbilly towns with 20,000 people in them. Let alone, and by the way, Bogota has over 10 million people. Medellin over 4 million. So that's like connecting Chicago with like a Minneapolis, St. Paul. I mean, that would be huge, right? So there's not the real multiplier effect because we already have infrastructure. And if you just layer infrastructure on top of infrastructure on top of infrastructure, you just get a Japan type of situation where they're just building bridges to nowhere, and they're just building highways just to nowhere. And in that case, then you have it's very detrimental, because you are taking resources and you're spending future purchasing power, whether it's in the form of additional taxation or in the form of additional inflation in the future, higher prices for goods and services, which is a stealth tax, as most of you guys know. So you're paying for it that way, but you're also paying for it because it's distorting the economy by taking resources away from certain projects and allocating them to projects that really are frivolous and don't hold any long-term economic value. You see, I mean, how much concrete or how much pavement or how much oil, how much manpower would be utilized to build another highway in the United States? A lot. Well, that could be those are scarce resources with alternative uses. So I don't know if that's your question, but that's I think that's where you're going with it. What are my thoughts on transitory inflation? Well, I'm actually doing a talk, a presentation at the Money Show on Thursday morning, I believe. And this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about inflation versus deflation. When essentially it's kind of, I'll be answering this question: is inflation transitory? The way you have to think about it is set that question aside for a moment, because the question is inflation transitory is answered by figuring out the probabilities of what the system will look like moving forward. So what system am I referring to? I'm talking about the dollar monetary system domestically in the United States. So you've got three scenarios, three possibilities. Number one is the system stays like it has been for the last, decades. The last, my goodness, that would be going back to, over 100 years. And this is a system where the banks, the commercial banks, are responsible for creating dollars. Definitely going back at least to Bretton Woods, because that's when the dollar was the reserve currency. And that's, in the 1950s is when we saw the rise of the euro dollar system, which was a way for commercial banks outside of the United States to also create dollar denominated bank liabilities. In other words, deposits, which is increasing the supply of dollars, right? So we like to think that the Fed is the quote unquote central bank. And Snyder says this all the time, and he says it very well. He says the central bank is not central to the dollar, not even close. They really have very little control over the dollar, because they have very little control over the supply of dollars in the real economy chasing goods and services. Because all they can do is create bank reserves. And so what? So let's say that their balance sheet goes to 100 trillion. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have any more broad money. You got a hell of a lot more base money. That's for sure. The Federal Reserve has a lot more liabilities, more assets. But so what? It doesn't necessarily mean that there's more dollars in the system. So the only thing that would do is increase the lending capacity. That would increase the balance sheet capacity of the commercial banks, theoretically. And I would argue maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, because if they're buying all of those assets from the commercial banks themselves, the commercial banks may be able to create more dollars with assets other than bank reserves, i.e. T-bills, right? And that gets into a very, very, very complicated rabbit hole. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole without a whiteboard to assist me. But the bottom line is the commercial banks have been responsible for creating new dollars, because when they create a loan, that's creating new dollars, right? It's not really a fractional reserve system anymore. It's I mean, the balance sheets kind of end up the same, but they're creating new money that just didn't exist before. They're creating, I shouldn't say money, they're creating new dollars that didn't exist before, right? So the commercial bank lending was responsible for creating more dollars, chasing fewer goods and services. So unless the banks were lending at a very high rate, it's difficult to get consumer price inflation, or at least like what we would consider very high consumer price, call it 15%, something like we saw in the 1970s, right? I would argue, obviously, that the CPI is a lot higher than they would lead us to believe. But to see something like we saw in the 1970s, you would need the commercial banks lending a lot. They've got to create a lot more dollars. But if the consumer balance sheet is tapped out, if we're tapped out at a state level, if we're tapped out at a corporate level, when I mean tapped out, I mean they just can't take on any more debt. They're leveraged to the hilt. And I guess the government can always take on more debt, but the consumer balance sheet it's tough for it to take on any more debt, or you get a situation where the banking system is just very skittish. They're apprehensive. They look around them and they see the same things we see. They see the economy being propped up by stimmies, and they're like, I don't know, man. I don't want to lend into this. Therefore, the commercial bank lending goes down, the amount of dollars go down, amount of new dollars created, and it's very difficult to get that 1970s type of action, right? Number two, I've got to wrap it up here to get over to the member live stream. But number two is a hybrid system, which we have now. And a hybrid system is where the commercial banks are still technically responsible for creating the dollars in the system, but the government is now helping. They're going around the commercial banking system because the government is spending quite literally trillions of dollars into existence that the Fed is monetizing. You see, normally when the government spends that much money, they're sucking the money out of the economy because people are using money, dollars, to buy those bonds, or they're sucking the dollars out of the system through taxation. And then they're just recycling those dollars by spending the same dollars they sucked out in the first place and just redistributing those dollars to a different group of people. But when the Fed monetizes the debt, it's a little different, or a lot different, because they're not sucking those dollars out in the first place. And if they are sucking the dollars out, they're sucking them out of the financial economy. They're not sucking them out of the real economy. You see? So, but then this hybrid policy is still the central bank is not central. They're held hostage by the commercial banks. Now they're held hostage by the politicians. So do you see transitory inflation in that environment? I would argue most likely yes, because at some point the politicians aren't going to agree. There's going to be gridlock. We're going to have more and more stimulus packages, but they're not going to be big enough. They just can't agree. Something's going to happen, right? Where we kind of peak out, and then you go, maybe not deflation, but you have disinflation. You do have kind of a transitory effect there, right? Or you got option number 3. Option number 3 is where the central bank is central. They do control the dollar. How do they control it? By a central bank digital currency. Central bank digital currency now means that we all have an account with the Fed. Every business, every entity, every person on this live stream right now has an account with the Fed. They ban cash, and then the Fed determines who gets a loan, and the Fed determines how many loans are created. And if the Fed determines that, if there's just one entity, they're not reliant on the politicians, they're not reliant on the commercial banks, then if they're controlling the amount of lending, they're also controlling the amount of dollars in the real economy that are being created. And remember, they don't have the constraints that the commercial banks have. See, the commercial banks are constrained by the fact that they need to lend to entities and individuals that can actually pay them back. They're constrained by that annoying little thing called profit and loss, where the central banks, the Fed, is not constrained by profit and loss. They don't care if they get paid back. They just need to create more loans. So I'll leave you with that. Is inflation transitory? If we stay in scenario 1 that I talked about, we're going to see most likely deflation, more disinflation, at least, especially in asset prices, maybe not in consumer prices. If we stay in this hybrid system, I think that we get it is transitory. If we move into that third system, then I do not believe inflation is transitory, and I believe that it's something that will be with us for a long time. All right, guys, I've got to head over to the Rebel Capitalist Pro member live stream, so I can't do shout outs. I apologize for being late today. I will make sure you guys go over to the Rebel Capitalist channel tomorrow for some live streams, and I'll do a lot of shout outs over there. You guys enjoy your evening. We'll see you on the next video.